Chapter 30. The men didn't wait for the sun to complete its departure beyond the horizon before they prepared to leave. Sheriff Scythe collected both his own horse and Maxwell Stanton's. Paxton fetched Castro and Velvet and harnessed them to a wagon, and then, with John's help, hoisted Strom into it. Although Reign doubted Strom would go anywhere with the deep hole in his leg, he firmly bound his wrists and securely fastened his ankles to the wagon, just to be sure. With great effort, Elizabeth held her tongue about lying next to her father's killer in the wagon, realizing there was little that could be done to change that. Her leg, in the condition it was, made it impossible for her to ride horseback or up front with her husband. Going to town later was definitely out of the question. She needed to see the doctor as soon as possible, even with Paxton's exceptional first aid. Paxton, seeing her reluctance to be in the same vicinity as Strom, tried to alter her paradigm by placing her personally in charge of the criminal. Fortunately, his plan was successful. Elizabeth took the surveillance seriously and was elated at having a responsibility, though she soon regretted having taken the trip at all, as each lurching bump the wagon endured was torture, and it gave her little comfort that Strom was experiencing the same torment. They arrived at town to find Paxton's workers crowded impassively on the sheriff's porch, looking quite destitute. Not one of them stayed in his seat when the wagon pulled up, and all of them were ready to absolutely devour any news of what had occurred back at the ranch. Maxwell listened quietly as Paxton, Elizabeth, and the sheriff avidly related details, with the occasional outburst from the prisoner. On the way into town, he'd been informed of the will and the fact that Elizabeth was actually the rightful owner of the Dalton ranch, where he was now residing. Since he'd never purchased the ranch and had no legal documentation of his dealings with her father, Maxwell had little choice but to concede to her ownership. His stomach had churned with the realization he had nowhere to go. His mansion had been donated to the town in a gesture of goodwill and in an effort to repair his reputation. Elizabeth studied Maxwell seriously and quietly pondered the possibility for some time before finally offering him the position of ranch caretaker. Astounded by her unwarranted generosity, he'd accepted and thanked her for the opportunity. He supposed that the guilt at having wrongly blamed him for her father's death was far more potent than her anger that he'd surreptitiously taken over the ranch and never paid a cent for it. In front of the sheriff's office, while he sat in his saddle listening to them tell how events had unfolded, Maxwell mused to himself with a somewhat sinister grin that he'd just discovered a way to reclaim his fame and fortune. He moved his horse forward and bid his sudden farewells to the group, and after politely wishing Elizabeth a speedy recovery, hurried his horse off toward the Dalton ranch. Dr. Manning had been summoned and arrived not long after Maxwell Stanton's departure. He ordered Elizabeth straight to his office, while Scythe insisted he treat Strom in the cell. The doctor agreed, knowing that Mrs. Reign's leg was far better wrapped than Strom's. He waited patiently while Strom was carried into his cell.
"Don't think you gotta fix him up perfectly, Doc," Scythe interjected. "Just waitin' on the death warrant from Judge Wheeler. He's gonna die at dawn."
"Dawn, eh?" Dr. Manning examined his patient. "Well, I'll try to ensure he makes that appointment." After the doctor finished with Jack Strom, Sheriff Scythe locked the cell door and hung the key around his neck. As Dr. Manning collected his things and headed for the door, the sheriff, a bit awkwardly, called, "Send me word on how the little lady's doin', will ya?" Dr. Manning grinned. "Will do, Sheriff. You plan on being here all night?"
"Yep. Sure ain't taking any more chances on this fella."
Dr. Manning glanced at Strom, marking his pallid color and the sweat on his brow. "I don't think you've anything to worry about, John."
"Jack's a slippery one. Like I said,
no chances." Elizabeth smiled at Dr. Manning as he finished rewrapping her leg after a lengthy examination and treatment. "I'm sure relieved you two know how to wrap a wound. Otherwise, I mightn't have had such a good diagnosis for you." He washed some blood from his hands. "The bullet missed the bone by inches and went straight through. Very lucky, Mrs. Reign. Very lucky indeed. Most people shot have little chance of a recovery like yours."
"Thank you, Doctor."
Paxton gently helped Elizabeth from the operating table. "Strom, if he makes it through the night, is likely hanging at dawn, the sheriff says. You two staying around?" Paxton flinched, and Elizabeth instantly empathized with his obvious feelings of compunction. "No, Doctor. We'd best get back to the ranch." Perplexed, not to mention surprised by her response, Paxton looked up. "But, Paxton, I know the truth. It's not essential I see my father's murderer hang." "I thought you'd want to see justice done." She shook her head, reaching for his hand. "Right now, all I want to do is go home with you and thank the good Lord we're alive." Dr. Manning nodded agreement. "Life should be celebrated, and I do think—" He smiled meaningfully, winking at Elizabeth, who smirked conspiratorially. "You have a lot of celebrating to do."